single warning light broke the dark of the flight deck. The aircraft was mechanically perfect, yet somehow they flew a perfectly good plane right into the side of a mountain. This has been aviation's biggest disaster for decades. Highly trained pilots flying blindly into unknown terrain. But how does a modern flight crew not see the ground hurtling toward them? TWA Flight 514 left Indianapolis on the morning of December 1st, 1974, bound for Washington National Airport with a scheduled stop in Columbus, Ohio. It was a Boeing 727 carrying 85 passengers. Captain Richard Brock, 44, was in the left seat. First Officer Leonard Krishek, 40, sat in the right. Flight engineer Thomas Safranek managed the systems panel behind them. 12 minutes after departing Columbus, Cleveland Air Traffic Control delivered unwelcome news. Washington National was closed. Crosswinds were gusting to 49 knots, far beyond safe limits. All inbound flights were being diverted to Dulles International Airport, about 36 miles west of the city, in the foothills of Northern Virginia. The critical exchange came at 4 minutes past 11. Flight 514 reported level at 7,000 feet. 5 seconds later, the Dulles approach controller said one sentence that would become the center of the entire investigation. Flight 514, you're cleared for approach to runway 12. No altitude restriction. No instruction to maintain 7,000 until reaching a specific point. Just cleared for the approach. Captain Brock interpreted the clearance the way pilots routinely did in 1974. He looked at his approach chart, a printed diagram showing the step-by-step descent path to the runway, and saw that the final checkpoint before touchdown had a published altitude of 1,800 feet. He announced to his crew, 1,800 is the bottom. The first officer began descending. The airplane was still 44 miles from the airport. At that distance, on a standard 3-degree glide path, it should have been above 8,000 feet. The altitude of 1,800 feet only applied at a point 6 miles from the runway. But the approach chart was poorly designed. The side view diagram did not extend far enough back to show the minimum safe altitude at their current position. That number, 3,400 feet, appeared only on the overhead view in small print. The crew never referenced it. As the 727 descended through the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, conditions were brutal. Rain, sleet, snow, and gusty winds battered the aircraft. Visibility dropped to near zero. The crew felt violent altitude swings of 100 to 200 feet and blamed downdrafts. The captain said he had briefly seen the ground. At 8 seconds past 11:09, the radio altimeter warning horn sounded. The captain called for more power. The horn sounded again. 6 seconds later, at 230 knots, Flight 514 struck the western slope of Mount Weather, Virginia, at an elevation of 1,670 feet. Trees were sheared off 70 feet above the ground in a clean line as if cut by a machine. The airplane broke apart on a rock outcropping and erupted into fire. All 92 people on board were killed. The mountain they hit was not just any mountain. Mount Weather housed a classified underground bunker built to keep the United States government running in the event of nuclear war. The crash severed its main phone line, but never reached the facility itself. For decades, its existence had been secret. The crash put it on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation exposed a systemic failure hiding in plain sight. The phrase cleared for the approach meant one thing to controllers and something different to pilots. Controllers used it to hand off navigation responsibility. Pilots heard it as authorization to descend to the final approach altitude. Neither side knew, the other interpreted it differently. And the Federal Aviation Administration had been aware of this confusion for years without acting. The most damning discovery came later. 6 weeks before the crash, a United Airlines crew had flown the exact same approach to the exact same runway and made the exact same error, descending to 1,800 feet while still 25 miles out. They realized the mistake after landing and reported it internally. But the report never left United Airlines. No one at TWA ever saw it. Flight 514 forced 3 changes that reshaped commercial aviation. First, the FAA mandated a ground proximity warning system, known as GPWS, on all large commercial aircraft, a device that alerts pilots when they are flying too close to terrain. Second, controllers were required to include explicit altitude instructions in every approach clearance, eliminating the ambiguity that killed 92 people. And third, where any pilot or controller can report a safety concern without punishment. That system is still in use today, more than 50 years later. Since 1977, Air New Zealand had been running sightseeing flights over Antarctica. A McDonnell Douglas DC-10 would leave Auckland in the morning, fly south for several hours, sweep low over the frozen continent so passengers could photograph the ice, and return the same evening. On past flights, the onboard guide had been Sir Edmund Hillary. Tickets sold out fast. On November 28, 1979, Flight 901 departed Auckland at 8 in the morning with 237 passengers and 20 crew. Captain Jim Collins and First Officer Greg Casson were in the cockpit. Neither had flown the Antarctic route before, but both had attended a briefing where they were shown the flight path. Printed materials showed the route taking them down McMurdo Sound, a wide corridor of flat sea ice between the continent and Ross Island. Safe, open terrain. What Collins and Casson did not know was that in the early hours of that morning, someone in Air New Zealand's navigation section had changed the coordinates of the flight's final waypoint. The airline believed it was correcting a long-standing error, but the effect was dramatic. The new coordinates shifted the flight path 43 kilometers to the east. Instead of flying down open water, the autopilot would now take the DC-10 directly over Ross Island, straight toward Mount Erebus. The crew was never told. As the flight approached Antarctica around noon, Collins contacted the United States Navy's air traffic control at McMurdo Station and reported he would be descending. McMurdo cleared him down to 1,500 feet. This was far below the route's minimum safe altitude of 16,000 feet, but low-altitude passes had become routine on these flights. Air New Zealand's own promotional brochure featured photographs clearly taken from well below the minimum. Previous crews had done the same thing without incident, because their route had always taken them over flat sea ice where there was nothing to hit. Collins engaged the autopilot and locked it onto the navigation track, the series of coordinates programmed into the computer before departure. The DC-10's navigation system was extraordinarily precise. If the computer said the track was safe, it was safe, except the track was now aimed at a volcano. As the airplane descended, a layer of cloud sat above clear air, and below the aircraft the snow-covered slopes of Mount Erebus blended perfectly into the overcast. No shadows, no contrast, no visible boundary between ground and sky. The white surface of the mountain became indistinguishable from the ice shelf behind it. Passengers took photographs seconds before impact, showing clear conditions with landmarks visible to the left and right. But directly ahead, where the mountain filled the windscreen, there was nothing to see. The volcano had disappeared into the white. At 12:49 in the afternoon, the DC-10 struck the lower slopes of Mount Erebus at 1,500 feet. All 257 people on board were killed instantly. The initial investigation, led by New Zealand's Chief Inspector of Air Accidents Ron Chippendale, blamed the pilots. His report concluded that Captain Collins should not have descended below the minimum safe altitude. Public outcry was immediate. Colleagues of the dead pilots pointed out that every previous Antarctic flight had done the same thing. The government established a Royal Commission of Inquiry, led by Justice Peter Mahon. Mahon's investigation uncovered what the first one had missed. He traced the coordinate change, established that the crew was never informed, and concluded that Collins and Casson had every reason to believe they were flying over open water. The dominant cause of the disaster, Mahon determined, was Air New Zealand's decision to reprogram the flight path without telling the pilots. He also found that the airline's executives had attempted to cover up their role and shift blame to the dead crew. His exact words became the most famous phrase in New Zealand legal history. He called their testimony an orchestrated litany of lies. Air New Zealand challenged the finding in court and won a partial reversal on the conspiracy allegation. But the core conclusion, that the airline sent the airplane into a mountain and never told the pilots, was never overturned. It took 40 years, but in 2019, both New Zealand's Prime Minister and Air New Zealand issued formal apologies. The Airbus A320 was the most technologically advanced narrow-body airliner in the world when it entered service in the late 1980s. It was the first commercial airplane to use fly-by-wire controls, meaning electronic signals replaced the mechanical cables that had connected the pilot's hands to the flight surfaces on every previous aircraft. Airbus had built it to be the future of aviation, but inside its cockpit was a design choice that would cost 87 lives. Flight 148 departed Lyon, France, at 5:20 in the evening on January 20th, 1992, bound for Strasbourg, near the German border. On board were 90 passengers and 6 crew. Captain Christian Heckett had 8,800 flight hours, but only 162 on the A320. First Officer Joel Cherubin had just 61 hours on the type. Both were experienced pilots, but new to this airplane. That evening, Strasbourg's active runway lacked a full instrument landing system, meaning the crew would have to calculate their own descent path manually using distance and altitude checkpoints. Captain Hecket was uncomfortable with this. Pilots at Air Inter rarely flew these approaches because most French airports had full electronic guidance. He asked controllers for an alternative, but was told it would mean a significant delay. He accepted. As the A320 began its descent, the captain needed to program how steeply the airplane would come down. The autopilot panel had a single knob that controlled two different functions, depending on which mode was active. In one mode, the knob set the descent in degrees. In the other, the same knob set the descent in feet per minute. The two modes were selected by a button on the panel, but the display showing the number looked nearly identical in both. Captain Hecket dialed in 3-3. He intended a descent angle of 3.3 degrees, a standard gentle approach, but the autopilot was in the wrong mode. Instead of a gradual glide, the computer read the input as 3,300 feet per minute, roughly 4 times steeper than normal. The airplane began plunging toward the Vosges Mountains. The critical design flaw was in the display. In flight path angle mode, the screen would have shown -3.3. In vertical speed mode, it showed -3.3, representing only the first 2 digits of 3,300. The only visual difference between the two was a tiny decimal point, so small that a pilot glancing at the panel in a high workload moment could easily miss it. Neither pilot caught the error. Both were new to the airplane. The airplane descended through clouds, losing altitude far faster than it should have been. Below them, the forested slopes of Mont Saint-Odile rose to 2,700 feet. There was one system that could have saved them, a GPWS, the Ground Proximity Warning System, the same terrain alert technology mandated after the TWA crash in Virginia 2 chapters ago. It would have detected the ground rushing up and fired a warning into the cockpit, but Air Inter had not installed one. France had been slow to enforce the international requirement. 1 month before the crash, French authorities had sent Air Inter a letter demanding to know why the systems were still not fitted. The letter came too late. At 6:20 in the evening, with no warning, the A320 struck the snow-covered slope of Mont Saint-Odile at 2,620 feet. 87 of the 96 people on board were killed. 9 survived, all seated toward the rear. They spent hours in freezing darkness, temperatures well below zero, waiting for rescuers to find the wreckage in the dense forest. The investigation by France's Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis concluded that the crew had set the autopilot to the wrong mode, but it did not stop there. It questioned why Airbus had designed a panel where 2 fundamentally different functions, one measured in degrees and the other in feet per minute, were controlled by the same knob and displayed with nearly identical numbers. A pilot seeing 33 had no immediate way to know whether the airplane was gliding gently or diving at 4 times the intended rate. Air Inter 148 forced Airbus to rethink how information was presented in its cockpits. Subsequent models added clearer mode displays, so pilots could instantly distinguish between descent modes. France enforced the GPWS mandate across its entire fleet, and the crash became one of the most studied cases in aviation human factors, a field dedicated to designing systems that work with human psychology rather than against it. Cali, Colombia, sits in a narrow valley flanked by the Andes. The mountains on either side rise above 10,000 feet. The approach requires pilots to navigate through a series of radio beacons that thread between the ridgelines, turning and descending at precise points. In 1992, guerrillas had destroyed the airport's approach radar, and by December 1995, it still had not been replaced. Controllers in Cali could talk to pilots, but they could not see them. American Airlines flight departed Miami on the evening of December 20th, 1995, about 2 hours behind schedule. It was a Boeing 757 carrying 155 passengers and 8 crew, many of them Colombians heading home for Christmas. The captain had flown into Cali 13 times before, including 11 days earlier. The crew was experienced. As the flight entered Colombian airspace and began its descent, the Cali controller offered a shortcut. Instead of the longer approach to runway 01, which had a full instrument landing system, the crew could fly a straight-in approach to runway 19. The wind was calm. The crew accepted, hoping to make up time. This single decision set the chain in motion. When the captain programmed the shortcut into the flight management system, the FMS, something unexpected happened. The computer's logic erased all the intermediate waypoints from the flight plan. Checkpoints the crew still needed, including the Tulua beacon north of the airport, vanished from their screens. The crew did not realize they were gone until the controller asked them to report passing Tulua, and they could not find it. Now behind the airplane and rushing to catch up, the captain tried to program the next waypoint, a beacon called Rozo, located near the runway. On the printed approach chart, Rozo was identified by the single letter R. The captain typed R into the navigation computer, but the computer's database used a different naming system. In Colombia, the letter R was already assigned to a completely different beacon called Romeo, located near Bogota, 150 miles to the northeast. The computer displayed Romeo as the first option. The captain selected it without realizing the mistake. The autopilot, following the computer's instructions, began turning the 757 to the left, away from Cali, and toward Bogota. The crew noticed the airplane was turning in the wrong direction, but did not immediately understand why. The captain disconnected the autopilot and turned right, back toward the airport. But by now, the airplane had drifted east, into a valley it was never supposed to enter, with a mountain ridge between them and the runway. At 9,000 feet, the GPWS fired. Both pilots reacted. The captain pulled back on the control column. The engines spooled to full power, but the speed brakes were still extended, creating enormous drag, robbing the airplane of the climb performance it needed. If the speed brakes had been retracted immediately and the crew had held the nose at the maximum pitch angle, they would have cleared it by 300 feet. Instead, the Boeing 757 struck trees on a ridge near the town of Buga at roughly 8,900 feet, 33 miles northeast of the airport. The airplane was destroyed on impact. 159 of the 163 people on board were killed. 4 passengers survived, all seated in the same row. The investigation identified the crew's loss of situational awareness as the primary cause, compounded by the FMS database that used a different naming system from the printed charts, the computer logic that erased critical waypoints without warning, and the failure to retract the speed brakes during the escape. American Airlines was found 60% at fault. Jeppesen, the company that built the navigation database, was found 30% at fault. Honeywell, the computer manufacturer, 10%. 20 minutes before impact, the cockpit voice recorder captured Captain Park Young-chul saying 2 words, "Really sleepy." He had been awake since 6 that morning, Seoul time. His normal bedtime was between 10 and 11 at night. By the time the Boeing 747 reached Guam, it was past 1 in the morning in his body's time zone. He had originally been assigned a longer flight to Dubai, but was pulled off it for insufficient rest. The shorter Guam flight was supposed to be easier. Korean Air Flight 801 departed Seoul on the evening of August 5, 1997, carrying 237 passengers and 17 crew. First Officer Song Kyung-ho sat in the right seat. Flight engineer Nam Suk-hoon occupied the 3rd position behind them. As the flight approached Guam after midnight, heavy rain reduced visibility. The glide slope component of the instrument landing system, the part that guides the airplane down at the correct angle, was out of service. Only the localizer, which provides left-right guidance, was working. The crew would have to fly a non-precision approach, calculating their own descent using altitude checkpoints and distance from radio beacons. Captain Park appeared to believe the glide slope was working. The flight engineer asked if it was functioning. The captain answered yes. Investigators later determined that the signal Park was following came from an unrelated electronic source on the ground. He was descending the 747 based on a phantom signal. The first officer and flight engineer both noticed problems. The airplane was descending too steeply. The airport was not visible through the rain, but Korean Air's cockpit culture was shaped by a strict hierarchy rooted in Korean social norms, where age and rank determined who could speak and how directly they could challenge a superior. Neither man told the captain he was wrong. Instead, they made indirect suggestions. The flight engineer hinted that the signal might not be the glide slope. The first officer noted the airport was not in sight. These were observations, not commands. The captain continued descending. There was one system at Guam that could have caught the error from the ground. The minimum safe altitude warning system on the approach radar was designed to alert controllers whenever an airplane dropped below a safe altitude. It had originally covered the entire approach corridor, including Nimitz Hill, a ridge 3 miles southwest of the runway. But the system generated too many false alarms, so the FAA had restricted its coverage to a narrow band far from the airport. Flight 801 was inside the disabled zone. The controller never received a warning. As the 747 descended through 730 feet, the first officer finally spoke with urgency. "Let's make a missed approach." The flight engineer followed. Not in sight, Missed approach. Then go around. The captain echoed the call 1 second later and pushed the throttles forward, but the airplane was already too low. At 1:42 in the morning on August 6th, the 747 struck Nimitz Hill at 660 feet, 3 miles short of the runway. 229 of the 254 people on board were killed. 25 survived, many with severe burns. The NTSB concluded that the primary cause was the captain's failure to execute the approach and the crew's failure to effectively challenge him. His fatigue was a contributing factor. So was Korean Air's inadequate training, and so was the FAA's decision to disable the altitude warning system at Guam. Korean Air 801 became a turning point for the global industry's understanding of cockpit culture. The concept that hierarchical cultures can inhibit the direct communication needed in emergencies, later explored in Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, drew heavily on this crash. Korean Air overhauled its entire training program, brought in outside consultants from Delta Airlines, and adopted English as the mandatory cockpit language to break the cultural barrier that had silenced the first officer and flight engineer. The airline's safety record improved dramatically, but the cost of that lesson was 229 lives on a hillside in Guam. Tenerife North Airport had already earned its place in aviation history. 3 years earlier, in 1977, 2 Boeing 747s had collided on the runway in dense fog, killing 583 people, the deadliest accident in aviation history. By 1980, the airport was still operating without radar. Controllers could talk to pilots, but they could not see them. Dan Air Flight 1008 departed Manchester on the morning of April 25, 1980, carrying 138 British tourists and 8 crew on a charter holiday to the Canary Islands. The airplane was a Boeing 727. Captain Arthur Whelan, 50 years old with more than 15,000 flight hours, had flown into Tenerife North 58 times before. First Officer Michael Firth, 33, had done it 9 times. Flight Engineer Raymond Carey, 33, had never been there. As the 727 approached the island, winds were blowing from an unusual direction, forcing all traffic onto runway 12, a seldom used approach. An Iberia turboprop was already on final. Controller Justo Kamen needed to hold the Dan Air flight until the runway was clear. The problem was that no published holding pattern existed for this runway. Kamen improvised one on the spot. He radioed the crew with instructions to hold over a radio beacon near the airport, using an inbound heading of 150 degrees with left-hand turns. But his exact phrasing contained a critical ambiguity. He said turn to the left. What he meant was turns to the left, describing the direction the crew should orbit while holding. Without that single letter, Captain Whelan interpreted the instruction as a command to make one left turn onto a heading of 150. He did not repeat the instruction back, which was not mandatory under the rules at the time. And because Kamen had no radar, he could not see what the airplane was actually doing. The 727 never passed directly over the beacon. Instead, it flew nearly 2 miles south of it, then turned left onto 150, heading straight toward mountainous terrain where the minimum safe altitude was 14,500 feet. The airplane was at 6,000. Then Kamen, believing the flight was safely in the holding pattern overhead. The beacon cleared them to descend to 5,000 feet. Had the hold been properly designed according to official guidelines, the minimum altitude would have been 7,000 feet. Kamen never calculated one because the hold did not officially exist. As the 727 descended through 5,000 feet in thick cloud, the proximity alarm fired. Terrain. Terrain. Captain Whelan broke off his left turn and turned right, believing this would take them away from the high ground. He could see nothing outside. In reality, the right turn took the airplane directly toward Mount La Esperanza, but for a few seconds, the aircraft passed over a valley, and the proximity alarm fell silent. Whelan took the silence as confirmation that his escape maneuver had worked. It had not. Seconds later, still in the right turn, still descending, the Boeing 727 struck the forested slope of La Esperanza at 5,450 feet, just 92 feet below the summit. The impact obliterated the aircraft. All 146 people on board were killed. The destruction was so complete that no intact remains were recovered. Several victims were never identified. The investigation became a bitter dispute between Spain and Britain. Spanish investigators placed primary blame on the Dan Air crew for descending into high terrain without verifying their position. British investigators argued that the controllers' improvised ambiguous instructions and the clearance to an unsafe altitude were direct contributors. Both sides agreed the crew should have asked for clarification. Neither side fully conceded the other's point. What emerged from the wreckage was one lasting change. Investigators discovered that had Captain Whelan simply pulled up and climbed straight ahead when the GPWS fired, the airplane would have cleared the mountain. Instead, he turned, not knowing which direction was safe. After this accident, the FAA began requiring airlines to train their pilots to respond to any ground proximity warning with an immediate climb. Wings level, full power, no turns, no hesitation, unless the ground is clearly visible. That protocol is now standard worldwide. It exists because a captain in the fog over Tenerife heard the alarm, did not know where he was, and turned the wrong way. For the first hour of the flight, Captain Pervez Iqbal Chaudhry did not talk about the approach, the weather, or the airplane. He spent it quizzing his first officer. The cockpit voice recorder captured a 61-year-old captain with 25,000 flight hours lecturing and belittling a 34-year-old first officer with barely 1,800. Investigators later described the tone as condescending and humiliating. By the time the Airbus A321 began its descent into Islamabad, First Officer Muntajib Ahmed had effectively stopped challenging anything the captain said or did. Airblue Flight 202 departed Karachi on the morning of July 28, 2010, carrying 146 passengers and 6 crew. The destination was Benazir Bhutto International Airport in Islamabad. Weather in the capital was deteriorating. Rain, low cloud, and visibility down to 3 miles. A China Southern flight had already diverted. The active runway was 12, which pointed southeast. There was no instrument approach for this runway because of the Margalla Hills, a chain of forested ridges rising to nearly 3,000 feet directly north of the airport. Pilots landing on runway 12 had to fly a circling approach, a visual maneuver that required them to see the airport and stay within a protected zone no more than 5 nautical miles from the field. Outside that zone, the hills were waiting. Captain Chaudhry chose to fly the circling approach using the autopilot's navigation mode, programming a series of custom waypoints into the flight computer. This was not standard procedure. Several of the waypoints he entered were outside the protected zone, dangerously close to the high terrain. When air traffic control asked if the crew was visual with the ground, both pilots replied yes. The first officer then said something that should have changed everything. "Sir, terrain ahead is coming." The captain replied, "Yes, we are turning left," but the airplane was not turning. Chaudhry was rotating the heading selector on the autopilot panel, dialing in new headings to the left, but he never pulled the knob to activate the change. The autopilot was still in navigation mode, following the programmed waypoints, flying the A321 straight toward the Margalla Hills. The captain was adjusting a dial that the airplane was ignoring. Then the enhanced ground proximity warning system activated. Terrain ahead. 2 predictive cautions. The first officer repeated his warning. The captain did not respond to the system. He did not change the autopilot mode. He did not disconnect and fly manually. He continued rotating the heading knob that was doing nothing. Over the next 70 seconds, the EGPWS issued 21 warnings. Terrain ahead. Pull up. Whoop whoop, pull up. 21 times the airplane told them they were about to die. The first officer's voice can be heard on the recorder, increasingly desperate. But he never took control of the airplane. An hour of humiliation in the cockpit had broken his willingness to override the captain. And the captain, whether from confusion, fixation, or sheer refusal to acknowledge the situation, never responded to a single warning. At 9:41 in the morning local time, the Airbus A321 struck the Margalla Hills at 2,858 feet in a steep left bank with a descent rate exceeding 3,000 feet per minute. The aircraft disintegrated on impact. All 152 people on board were killed. It was the deadliest aviation disaster in Pakistan's history and the first fatal accident involving an A321 anywhere in the world. The investigation by Pakistan's Civil Aviation Authority concluded that Captain Chaudhry had created what they called a self-made unsafe environment. He had ignored air traffic control, flown outside the protected zone, mismanaged the autopilot, and disregarded 21 terrain warnings. His treatment of the first officer during the flight had destroyed any possibility of effective crew resource management. The very system designed after crashes like Eastern 401 to ensure that someone in the cockpit always speaks up. The first officer had been trained to speak up. He tried, but after an hour of being torn apart by his captain, when the moment came to grab the controls and save 152 lives, he could not bring himself to do it. The Sukhoi Superjet 100 was Russia's first new passenger jet since the fall of the Soviet Union. It was designed to compete with regional airliners from Embraer and Bombardier, and by 2012, Sukhoi had 170 orders and ambitions to build 1,000. To sell the airplane in Southeast Asia, the company organized a promotional tour called Welcome Asia, flying the jet from country to country so airline executives could see it, sit in it, and fly in it. The tour had already visited Kazakhstan successfully. In Pakistan, a technical problem grounded the original airplane and a replacement was flown in from Moscow. On May 9, 2012, the tour reached Indonesia. The airplane departed Jakarta's Halim Airport at 2 in the afternoon for a short demonstration loop. On board were 45 people, 8 crew, 2 Sukhoi representatives, and 35 passengers, most of them executives from Indonesian Airlines considering large orders, along with 5 aviation journalists. The captain was Alexander Yablontsev, 57, a former Russian military test pilot and cosmonaut who had flown the very first Superjet prototype in 2008. He had more than 10,000 flight hours. The co-pilot was Alexander Kochetkov, 44. This was the second demonstration flight of the day. 20 minutes into the flight, the crew requested permission to descend from 10,000 feet to 6,000. Air traffic control approved the request. 2 minutes later, they asked to orbit to the right. Also approved. That was the last communication between the airplane and the ground. What neither the controller nor, critically, the crew appeared to fully appreciate was the terrain below them. Mount Salak, an active stratovolcano, rose to 7,254 feet just south of the airplane's flight path. The Jakarta post had called it an airplane graveyard. 7 aircraft had crashed in the area in the previous decade. Clouds were shrouding the mountain that afternoon. The crew could not see it, and they did not have proper navigational charts for the area around Salak. The charts they were carrying did not adequately depict the terrain. As the Superjet flew its right orbit and began heading back toward Jakarta on a southwesterly course, the enhanced ground proximity warning system activated. Terrain ahead, pull up. The system was working exactly as designed. It had detected the mountain directly in the airplane's path and issued the standard warning. Then a second alert, avoid terrain. The crew did not pull up. They did not turn. Instead, they switched the warning system off. They believed the terrain database was faulty, that the warnings were false alarms triggered by incorrect data. The cockpit voice recorder revealed another critical factor. In the moments before and during the warnings, the captain was not focused on flying. He was in conversation with one of the potential buyers who had been invited onto the flight deck, a practice that would be prohibited on a normal airline flight, but was common on promotional demonstrations. 38 seconds after the first warning, the Sukhoi Superjet 100 struck the cliff face of Mount Salak at an elevation of 6,270 feet. The airplane disintegrated on impact and slid down a steep slope. All 45 people on board were killed. Search teams did not reach the wreckage until the following morning, more than 17 hours later. The terrain was so steep, nearly vertical in places, that rescuers had to hike a kilometer through dense jungle to reach what remained of the aircraft. Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee concluded that the crew had ignored a functioning terrain warning system because they assumed it was malfunctioning. They lacked proper charts. They were distracted by non-essential conversation. And air traffic control at Halim had no minimum safe altitude warning system to catch the error from the ground. The controller, overworked and managing multiple aircraft, did not notice that the Superjet had disappeared from radar for more than 17 minutes before anyone raised an alarm. The Sukhoi Superjet crash is the final chapter in this story for a reason. Every previous disaster in this video contributed to the development of terrain warning technology, from the basic GPWS mandated after TWA 514 to the enhanced systems with GPS databases introduced after American 965. By 2012, the technology existed to prevent exactly this kind of accident. The airplane had it installed. It was working. It told the crew precisely what was about to happen, and the crew turned it off. The mountain did not care whether the pilots believed the warning or not. It was there. It had always been there. And the airplane flew straight into it. 4 decades, more than 1,300 people, a light bulb in Florida, a clearance not understood in Virginia, a change of course that was never told to anyone in Antarctica, a missing word in a controller's instruction to a plane over Tenerife, a dial that looked exactly the same in 2 different modes in France, a valley filled with mountains, no radar coverage in Nepal, a navigation computer that could not tell 2 beacons apart in Colombia, a culture that would not let a first officer say no in Guam, a captain that crushed his co-pilot's confidence even before the approach began in Pakistan, and a crew that shut off the one system that could have saved them all in Indonesia. All of these airplanes were flyable. All had their engines running, their wings intact, their pilots at the controls. None of them had to crash. But crash they did, because the people flying them did not know where they were, or did not believe what their instruments were telling them, or were never told where they were to start with. The aviation industry learned from each of those tragedies. After Eastern 401, crew training was rebuilt from scratch. After TWA 514, terrain warning systems became mandatory. After Air Inter 148, cockpit displays were reworked. After American 965, a new technology provided a map of every mountain in every direction. After Korean Air 801, an entire airline rebuilt their cockpit culture from the ground up. Each of those reforms has helped make flying safer. Plane crashes caused by perfectly good airplanes flying into terrain they could not see have decreased by more than 90% since the 1970s. That technology works. That training works. But as we see in the final segment of this video, there is no system that can protect an airplane if a crew chooses not to trust it. The mountain does not negotiate. It does not wait for the pilots to finish their conversation, to look at their maps. It just sits there. If those stories stayed with you, if you'd like to understand how and why those kinds of tragedies happened, what changed as a result of them, then subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next episode. We have more to tell.